Welcome back to Minnesota's Let's Talk, a podcast that brings you valuable resources for prospective and current adoptive and foster families, as well as professionals. My name is Chris, and I'm an education coordinator at Minnesota.
And I'm Bridget, education director at FAM.
Well, hey, Bridget, Charlie Joyce and Dr. Rick Delaney are back for the last episode in this series. Charlie and Rick have a long history of helping child welfare staff, mental health professionals, foster, kinship, and adoptive parents. They've tried to retire, but I think since they both care so deeply about the foster care world that they continue to share their knowledge, expertise, and many, many years of hands-on experience working in this field. Charlie and Rick are wonderful people with kind-hearted souls.
Absolutely, they are. It has been a true pleasure having them as our guests. And in case our listeners need a little reminder, we do offer certificates of completion if you listen to our podcasts. And some of the feedback we've gotten from listeners who have requested certificates is how helpful these topics have been and how they feel seen and more understood, because some of the topics or issues that we've presented with them have often gotten overlooked or aren't discussed. So I just really appreciate them diving into some of the things that they've seen and heard over their years of experience and giving us their insights, knowledge, and expertise.
Yeah, agree. And if listeners are just tuning into this episode, you're missing out. Be sure to check out and listen to recent episodes with Charlie and Rick about pre and post visitation challenges for youth in foster care and foster parents, anger and aggression directed at mother figures in foster care, school issues for children in foster care, the exhaustion of parenting a child with bottomless needs, if our family provides foster care, will our family change? And today's topic, fire setting behavior in children. Welcome, Charlie and Rick. It's great to have you back. Let's talk. Why is it important for foster parents, kinship providers, and others to know about fire setting? And Rick, should we start with you?
Oh, yeah. And it's great to be back, always. And yeah, I think fire setting, fire starting, goes by different names, match play, playing with fire, is one of the most challenging behaviors for the child welfare system. And it's typically a secret behavior, so it's especially alarming and worrisome to foster parents. It's a huge safety issue, number one. Safety is job one. And for the child who starts fires, it's a safety issue there because they're often the one that gets injured. For others in the family, in the community, not to mention the structures that are maybe destroyed or damaged. So it's a huge issue, and it's more common than we think. Probably half of the fires in the United States, and there's a lot of fires set, thousands of fires set by people through the year, and about half of those are attributed to young children. So, it's a big issue, and it's a warning flag when that happens. And I'm sure many parents wonder, should I worry about this one incident? I've discovered something here. Uh, what are my next steps? Will it happen again? How safe can we keep our children? Things like that. So, yeah, it's a big issue.
One of the things I want to reinforce, Rick, that you mentioned is I think that foster parents deal with all kinds of disruptive behaviors, and I'm always amazed at their skill in dealing with them. But my practice experience shows, both as a caseworker and as a therapist, that if they have a child in placement that is experimenting with fire, that is a really, really serious things for foster parents, and sometimes is initially seen as an ender of the placement because of the concern for their own families, each other, and it just strikes fear, as it should, into families as far as when this happens. And so one thing I always try and remember is that if a child that is in placement is experimenting with fire or has some incidents of fire setting, as soon as that's known, I really suggest that the family does make a therapeutic referral and contact the caseworker, because even if it's more of an innocent type of fire setting, there's pieces of what we call as psychoeducation that are can benefit both the family and the child regarding this issue that at first starts with, oh my goodness, we don't know if we can go on with this placement. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, Rick, about how serious it is in the eyes of foster parents.
Yes, and I think Charlie too, what you were getting into there is let's circle back around and talk about that a little bit more near the end of our discussion today, like next steps that parents can take to make them feel less anxious, more prepared, and more.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've got a case study I can walk through too, that towards the end, that really breaks down the various steps that a foster family caseworker and a therapist did on behalf and with a child that was had some incidents of fire setting. Yeah, good.
Yeah, so I think, as a next step, I think we can all relate to or remember times when we've heard that term, he's a fire starter or she's a fire starter. And kids can get labeled with that, whether, for multiple different reasons. But maybe you guys could help us break down that label a little bit and kind of piece out, is there just one type of kid that does this? What motivates kids to start fires? What's the purpose of it? How can it look the same and different, for different kids?
That's great. Well, I think unpacking it is the way to get into this because it takes some understanding and awareness. And I think that alone sort of equips parents to think beyond just the immediate reaction of worry and fear. But yeah, just to answer the point directly, there's more than one type of fire setting or fire starting. And Charlie had mentioned one of them that's the most frequent, which is the curious experimentation, I wonder what this would do sort of thing that kids do. And often they start at very young ages. Most fire setting is done from 5 to 10 year olds. And children will start, if you can believe this, as early as 2 or 3 if they get a lighter or lighters, I think especially might be safety matches might be a little bit harder for them to negotiate, but lighters and what are those barbecue things that we have that, with the long extension, I don't even know what you call them, but they're barbecue lighters, let's call them. Kids get their hands on that and the right kind of material and have access to that. Uh, they can do some real damage quickly. That's the curiosity accidental. It doesn't mean there's anything pathologically wrong with the child. It's playing with matches, we call it. There's no intent to really destroy or to injure anybody. There's no malice, but it's the most common. And, even if it's innocent, the results can be quite the same in which life can be lost, people can get injured, things like that. So that'd be the first one. Charlie, and you mentioned that one. So that's people are probably all experienced with that. In fact, many of us, truth be known, as children, might have done some of that along the way and uh, lived to tell the story about it. But still, it can be a risk factor. And then the second one is a cry for help. The cry for help is more concerning, and we can talk about that. But I know a little foster child that thought he was upset about a visit not occurring, and for some reason, I don't know the logic of this in a child's mind, but he ended up starting a fire at the library on a Sunday when it was closed by putting a little paper in the book return thing and thought, oh, this will be cute. They'll see that the books are burned. Well, yeah, it burned the couple books he was returning for the family, but it spread from there. And apparently he looked pretty chagrined and worried when fire alarms went off through the town. And the foster family wondered, why are you reacting this way? Well, he had been quite distressed. And again, that's a cry for help. Um, Children who burn themselves with cigarettes. It's non-suicidal self-injury, we often call it. But teenagers often and preteens, we've heard about that, cutting, carving, and burning. So playing with matches, having candles in their room that they can have access to. The third one, so we got the experimentation and cry for help. The third one is delinquent, and it's usually teenagers or preteens. You can picture it's usually boys more boys than girls anyway. They get together and they think, I've got a good idea, and it's usually not a good idea. And they're in somebody's barn or garage. They have access to materials. They, it's really pretty equated to vandalism. It happens often at schools and other settings like that, abandoned buildings. But it starts with, I've got an idea, and it's the kind of group think in which they're not thinking, and maybe they're trying to impress each other with their bravery or whatever. Then severely disturbed. Now this one is they're all concerning, but with severely disturbed, this is a child that might have an extreme fixation on fire. You know, I heard in a very extreme example of children setting fire to other people, children's toys because they were jealous,
Mhm.
but also setting fire to another child. And no one could ever really determine whether the child was sort of accidentally right there where flammable material was. But that's where it gets extremely dangerous and concerning. And there might be an actual desire to harm or kill. And very rare, but some of the things, Charlie, I think maybe you'll talk about when we get to the end piece here, or you even might want to weigh in now, is how we parse that out. Which ones are which of these? You know,
Sure.
how is a parent to know how worried should I be? And
One thing that I appreciated about when you brought up kids at times will do this out of curiosity and really kind of from an innocent type of basis. And I think of what we don't do lots of times with kids is when we first, with that type of kid that experiments with fire, what we haven't done is we haven't provided them a knowledge of the flip side, such as you're out camping and you say to your family and your kids, hey, let's start a bonfire. Everybody gets around the bonfire. It's nice. We talk about how warm it is, how comforting it is, how we all enjoy having those bonfires. But what we don't tell kids is you got to be really careful with these fires. You, you,
right,
you, you,
right.
you can't do this in your room at home. It can cause big consequences. So we always have to, I think, whenever we're dealing with fire, equate it with there's high risks involved with it also. And I think that's a missing piece sometimes for the kids that just are experimenting, are
Yeah.
curious about it. They don't get the missing piece until it's caused a problem. The other thing that that I wanted to mention, Rick, is on the delinquent type of behavior. You know, delinquent behavior, serious delinquent behavior, you don't have single incidences. You don't have a child that shoplifts once, experiences consequences for shoplifting, and then you see no other delinquent behavior. That's a child that's made a mistake, has learned from it, has a sense of conscience over that they did something wrong. I think with fire setting and delinquent behavior, or as we refer to as conduct disorder behavior, where you really need to be concerned is is it more than one incident, and has the previous incidences had consequences applied to them that one didn't work? Two, how was it done? Is it done in a secretive way where it's a hidden behavior? Three, are there other instances that unfortunately that child has displayed where they have intentions to hurt, um, control, intimidate other kids? Um, and if those factors are all present, there's issues of concern that should be applied to that type of fire setting. That is kind of a delinquent profile. And those are the ones we really need to be concerned about. Your thoughts on that, Rick?
No, I couldn't agree more. And my thought is the term conduct disorder includes usually things like vandalism, fire
Exactly.
setting, lying, stealing, running away,
Yeah,
aggression. You've mentioned all those things, but if it's a persistent pattern of those types of things, it's not just a one-off
that's
in
right.
one limited area from which the
Mhm,
child learns a life lesson and moves on.
mhm.
Then it's quite concerning, isn't it? Yeah, and
Yeah,
you wonder about again in those kind of situations. And with all of these situations, there's often room for getting an evaluation, mental health assessment. Uh, and the first thing that I think, well, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but I think that screening is very important for
Mhm.
children, for the safety of all involved.
Mhm.
But there are risk factors, and I think, you were talking about the child's own risk here in terms of these other behaviors they have that are conduct disorders. That would heighten the risk, and we'd be on red alert for that, wouldn't we? But there are other risk factors. I'm wondering, uh, Bridget, Chris, if that raises any questions for you about, what should families be looking for in terms of the past of the child or the kind of stress they're under, that type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what I hear you guys talking about is you see a behavior, something comes up that's very concerning. And I like what you said, Rick, about let's unpack it. And I think another way to look at that is to kind of go back through the history and understand if there's trauma, understand if there's a pattern and all that stuff. So, yes, if you guys could speak to just, yeah, kind of what to watch for, what risk factors to be looking for, I think that'd be really helpful to better understand for our foster families.
Well, I would like to make a comment about that. And Charlie, you've worked with so many foster families, I'm sure, and a lot of them that raise teenagers
Mhm.
with high risk. But question I get asked is the rate of fire setting among foster children, children in care, is it higher?
Mhm.
Or is it about the same? Like they say that 1 out of 20 kids probably is going to have some fire setting in their childhood. Um, but when you get to situations like kids who are in outpatient counseling or clinics, kids that have emotional issues, it could be as high as 1 in 4 or 1 in 5. So, and then you think about it in terms of what about the kids that have had to go to psychiatric hospitals, facilities, and so on. Well, then it's could be as high as maybe 30% or 40% of those kids. So the more emotionally charged situations that the child is dealing with, the higher risk that puts them at. And some of it has to do with, as with many of our kids and all the problems we've talked about over our podcast series here, is relational trauma, the exposure to stress, domestic violence, marital difficulties, child abuse, of course, and domestic violence, and higher just general levels of dysfunction and chaos within a family, where perhaps there's not much supervision and monitoring of children's safety. That combined with the stress level, the child may be using fire setting as an outlet. So that's one thing I wanted to bring up right away is that we're in the age of trauma-informed care and that informing how we understand kids. And that's one of the things to look at first for parents and try to be aware of. And caseworkers too that are helping our parents and therapists that they're delving into the past.
Yeah, I think we've gotten good at understanding trauma and its impact. Um, the way that if I kind of make that in a Charlie understanding of how trauma impacts people and kids, it has to land somewhere. The events and the traumatic experiences land somewhere psychologically. And then our response is to try to develop a way to cope with that, cope with the fear, the pain of what's happened. And I think those are very unusual ways at times that people come up with how to cope with trauma. I mean, I've seen situations where a child had a small piece of a blanket, probably 6 inches by 2 inches, that they would use to self-soothe. And it looked like, well, why does that child have that little piece of blanket? It was important. That's how he soothed from the trauma. We've seen unhealthy behaviors, as Rick mentioned, cutting, self-destructive behaviors, mood problems as a result of traumatic experiences. And there is cases where the fire setting fits into a way to cope with traumatic experiences. And again, this is from my own practice experience, where I've seen that as a response to trauma is in a way that appears destructive to the child it has been calming. And I've seen other situations where it has been a reenactment of a part of the trauma that makes sense to the child. And I love Rick's term, and I know you commented on it, Bridget, about unpacking. And I think when we see these things, including me, the first reaction is, oh my goodness. And it's really important, I think, to step back and try and unpack what is this about? What's the purpose of that behavior? And if we can do that, then I think we can come up with, number one, some ways to help the child heal, but also for the parents to understand that this isn't only something that's a risky behavior, but there is a purpose that it serves for the child. And that always helps as far as slowing us down and being able to respond in a helpful way.
Very nice, Charlie. Yeah, I like that. The unpacking idea again, the sorting out, um, looking into triggers, reenactment. Also, I think trying to see this in terms of or question what the child might be thinking, feeling, or intending that they're not expressing in words. So they
Exactly.
apparently, and pardon the pun here, but they have a smoldering rage, let's say, that they're burning with anger about this or that, burning, all these types of fire-related words describe emotional states in our language. But is the child voicing that, uttering that, or are they going off, fire setting by definition pretty much is secretive,
Mhm.
clandestine, without supervision. This is the dangerous fire setting.
Mhm.
And so the child is up to their own devices at this point. And there's a lot of emotion oftentimes that we need to sort of delve into with the child.
Mhm.
And
And I
Charlie,
don't
is
think,
this where you have a case example or a case study that you
sure,
wanted to share? Is that a good
sure,
spot for this?
I can go into that. This was a wonderful child, by the way, that remained in placement. And the child came to this country as an unaccompanied minor from a war-ravaged country. And he did very well in placement. Um, had learned in the camps, the refugee camps, some English, and he was very bright. So he worked on that hard. He worked hard in school. He actually did very well in school. He was almost, excuse me, overly compliant in the foster home, and everybody was very happy with how things were going. In fact, if I can do a little bit of a Charlie tangent there, they said the honeymoon period is great. And I want to comment on honeymoon periods, and then we'll get back to the specific case. But honeymoon periods, I've learned, kids have taught me that what that's about is the child is hypervigilant to determine if they are safe in the home. And so they are putting a lot of attention and reading what pleases parents, what pleases the family. And they're very active in trying to do that to guarantee their safety. Now, you can't keep up that level of hypervigilance forever. And so it diminishes, and sometimes the behavior that then is displayed isn't in line with what everybody thought the child should continue to do during the honeymoon period. And that gets framed in a way that the child was really good and now they're not so good, they're bad. But I want people to understand that that honeymoon period should be seen as a child working hard to see if they are safe and figuring out ways how they can really survive and do well in a family that's unknown to them. So that's the end of my Charlie tangent, but I just wanted to respond because this child had a wonderful honeymoon period. So the parents found they didn't experience him setting fires, but what they found in his room was an ash pile and some burned matches by the window. And they were befuddled on how they didn't discover it and such. And when they questioned him initially about it, his response was a shameful one. He internalized and he couldn't verbalize what that was about. And so they just kind of went on at that point, and thought, well, maybe this is a single incident. It happened again in their backyard where he had started a fire. And that did not get completely out of control, but it burned more than he intended it to do. And everybody's concern was pretty heightened at that time. And he was more open to identifying along with the family that this was a problem. And the caseworker was alerted after the first incident, which is always important. But after the second one, a therapeutic referral was made on behalf of this child. And what the child was able to share with some work was that it was a way of reenactment. When he left the village that he lived in, he knew that his mother had been killed. He did not know where his father was. His father lived in a different village with extended family, which was common, the way that the extended family was set up. But he knew that their village had burned, and he was able to identify eventually, as part of therapy, that the fire setting for him was calming in a traumatic way, that it recreated kind of a reminiscent of home. And he was obviously had complex grief that was associated with the multiple losses that he experienced. So that was our working hypothesis when we started, that the purpose of the behavior was self-calming to him, because his description was not that it excited him, it made him calm down and feel settled. And the family was involved with this child highly. They cared deeply about him, and that was reciprocal to the child, to the family. We did do some very concrete things. We identified a very specific safety plan for all members of the family, which included things like, this is accepted, this is not accepted. We secured things that were combustibles. I think every match and fire stick, like Rick was talking about, those things that click and you light your campfires with and stuff, all those things were either secured, locked up, or removed from the home. We also, as part of the safety plan, had in, and he was cooperative with this, which was that there would be unscheduled room checks where the foster parents, but he knew that they would be doing that, would check the room for any incident or for any fire making material. We were very fortunate in that the local fire department we had reached out to in previous cases, but that they would do a short educational session with children and young adults about the risks of fire. We didn't want it to be like a scared stiff thing, but we did want them to really educate along the lines of this can become very dangerous very quickly. This is how fires operate. This could happen. We wanted him to know the risks of that. And we worked with a specific person through the fire department. They were very good at doing that. He was involved therapeutically with a trauma model of treatment. We modified the trauma-focused CBT therapy. We used the term, instead of trauma narrative, we used the term your strength and survival story, because for so many of these kids, they survived circumstances that are just unbelievable. And we wanted them to see the strength that they had shown through their journey. And that's what we called it. And that worked really well with him. He took a lot of pride in his survival. And of course, as a part of creating his strength and survival story, there was a lot of work on complex grief. We had, at the last that I knew, he is now a young adult, we did not see any additional fire setting. But if I can back up a little bit, the issue with him was he had multiple traumas, but one of his last memories that he was able to share was looking back and seeing his village burn. And although we would see that as a very traumatic event, which it was indeed, for him it was calming in the way that somehow with him lighting fire, it was a reenactment of that experience that was his last experience with his home before he achieved the new home. So that's a case study. And I must say that the case studies that Rick and I offer, they always have happy endings, and that's not always the case. But in this situation, I'm glad to say it was.
Yeah, and that's a fascinating story and study that you talked about there. I believe it's so paradoxical that a child would be soothed by or by reenactment, but let's face it, it's a connection, the last connection with the
It,
trauma of parting his village. There's one of the things that you mentioned in this was that thrill seeking. This was not a thrill for the child, it was calming. It was almost like tranquilizing rather than jazzing up. But with some kids, as we know, that's one of the risk factors is getting back to the idea of a risk factor, thrill-seeking behavior, which is often seen more in the teenagers. And we talked about the pattern of conduct disorders. It's interesting that teenage girls, more of them are anxious and depressed as fire setters. So it's more of that expression rather than it's more an internalizing thing with a little bit of an externalizing behavior of fire setting. Whereas with boys, it's often fits the profile of a conduct disorder, something along that lines. There's a couple other examples, Chris, that I wanted to weigh in just to show some of the other unpacking that can be done here. Just two real quick examples. One
Yeah, go
child,
ahead.
yeah, I was thinking you might find this interesting where a little guy got up in the middle of the night, he's about 5, gets into the refrigerator, nobody knows he's awake, he's a little foster child, and he gets a carton of milk out, uh, puts it on the gas stove,
yeah.
turns the gas stove on. Why? We don't know. Was he wanting to warm milk? Not so sure. But you're thinking, well, that's not going to end well. But luckily, see, the fire, the gas um, was put out because the carton melted and the milk just doused the flames. So good news, right? Bad news is now we got gas fumes coming into the house.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
The family sleeping. Luckily, they had safety precautions and woke up. Now this is another little risk factor is that kind of mischievous little child who roams at night and who maybe I think he had an ADHD diagnosis, but quite impulsive, quite immature, no sense of what the consequences could be. And so he thought that was a real good idea. And luckily it was a happy ending, though a risky situation. The other story to contrast that is a story of a little guy about the same age, if I remember, and it's a different little boy, but he honeymooned for months and months and months, Charlie, where he was on his best behavior. He was a little Boy Scout, maybe an altar boy part-time, but he was totally compliant. But the foster mother said, sometimes I worry about him because what I'll say is, please go pick up your room. And he's right in the middle of doing something he wants, which most kids then would automatically protest. Can't I wait till this or that? Or, they negotiate with us. He would smile a kind of a sickly little grin, a fakey little grin, and trot off to do what he was told. But on some of those occasions, he went off and he set fire to the towels in the bathroom right after he smilingly went off to do what he was supposed to do. Again, sort of a protest, definitely. Not using his words though, but it's an act of defiance in a little child who had to do that instead of face to face, had to do that in a secret way. Again, could be a dangerous situation, but a different sort of unpacking for that little guy.
Mhm.
You know, I saw a situation, Rick, similar to what you were describing, where a child, this was a significant neglect, and that there were three children in this family, and they had been just left alone for long periods of time. And they used the stove. Luckily, it was an electric stove. They used the stove as a heating source when their parents were away. Um, and that it didn't result in a fire, but it easily could have. Um, and it was truly a neglect-based behavior, which luckily the foster
Mhm.
parents learned about very quickly. So they were able to assure the child that they would always be warm. And I gave them
Right.
examples.
Well, and that kind of leads into a next question about what misconceptions and beliefs folks might have about fire setting.
Yeah, there's a few of them I'd say that stand out. One is to sort of minimize match play and, to see burn marks in the carpet or a cigarette lighter that had been moved that you left out by accident, candles that have been used that you didn't authorize the use of, things like this. Things like that can be minimized, but the earlier we intervene with a child, we can prevent it from escalating into something else down the road. So that'd be the first misconception. The other one is that, oh, all kids are going to play with matches and they're just going through a phase, let them grow out of it. Not so much. Again, the early intervention thing. Charlie, I think you're going to talk about that in a little bit, how we can get some help there. Um, and sometimes a sort of a fatalistic sense that there's no way to really help these kids, so don't take them into your home as a foster parent. There's no way we can support you in taking the child. They must be sent away, and no reason to get to the bottom of what's going on with them. And they're all pyromaniacs and don't belong in a foster home. These are just overly judgmental, simplistic, and it's a sign of folks, I think, being scared, not knowing
Mhm.
Mhm.
what is the path forward once we discover that a child
Mhm.
has had an encounter with fire.
Mhm.
What do you think,
Right.
Charlie? Yeah.
Mhm.
Or
I, the one thing I would add to that is that I think we, as adults, we think that everybody understands the serious consequences of fire. And kids have taught me that's not the case, that they don't see past that. Um, oh, this is kind of cool and exciting. I saw my friend do it. They don't think that, well, this could end up burning down the whole house or that type of thing. So I think it's really important that if we do have children in our care that are experimenting, that we respond to that too. But we also understand that part of that is that psychoeducation piece, that they have to learn that there's consequences to that type of play.
Mhm. And I really like what you said, Rick, about fear and how that can motivate or, you know, kind of force or make foster parents make really hard decisions kind of quickly. And that's what I like hearing from you and Charlie about not going this alone. And also kind of weaves back just to our very beginning of why this is so important that we talk about it. Um, because there is so much, the fear can just overwhelm, I think, families sometimes and their responsibility to keep everybody safe. So if I could just sum it up a little bit, it's like, don't go it alone. There are some misconceptions. It is it's workable. It's something that we and can work through, with the right resources and support, which maybe kind of brings us to our last question for you too, around this topic, which is, what are kind of those resources? How do we pull in those supports, and help families kind of work through the fire setting behaviors?
well, I have some initial thoughts, and I hope everyone will have some ideas to add to this. Um, the initial thing is that I believe that we need to be supporting our foster parents and giving them a heads up when they take a child. And that when children are coming into care in the first place, the first time, for example, that we're screening them. I'm not sure that we're doing that. I can't swear to that, what the procedures are in Minnesota for doing that. But we do use some mental health screening devices. But do we ask these questions? Has the child played with matches? Has the child ever burned something or set anything on fire? Um, how many times? What were the damages? These answers cannot necessarily predict if a child is going to do it again, but it gives a heads up. And we also have more information if a child has moved from one house to another. Let's say, children move on average maybe once a year or so sometimes. Um, if one family has to move the child for whatever reason, was one of the reasons that they were afraid of the fire setting. There's no, to my way of thinking, there's not a real lot of justification for concealing that information, that it doesn't allow for the next family to be prepared, better prepared, put up safety plan in place.
Mhm.
Anyway, I'll stop there, but what do you think about that, Charlie?
Well, I just reiterate a lot of what you said. I think that one of the dynamics in foster care placement, unfortunately, is that availability of placement many times drives placement. And I think in the rush of needing to place children, sometimes we all forget to ask the questions of tell me about the child and have specific things that we want to know about the child, and fire setting should be one of those questions we ask. Does the child have a history of fire setting? The other thing I would add to that is, again, and I think this is the strength of FAM Minnesota, is that education of foster parents is so important, because you cannot be prepared for all the things that children will bring to your homes, considering the very, very unfortunate and traumatic experiences and separations that they've had. So a podcast like this, hopefully foster parents will listen to this podcast and learn a little bit more about fire setting. That's important. And then the other thing is, if you're aligned with therapists that have a good understanding of the separation and loss dynamics that are inherent in foster care, and a good understanding of how the traumas encountered by children and adults, how those can play out in a variety of ways, and be trained in a way that responds to those traumatic experiences. And if your organization, that is your licensing organization, is aligned with some therapists that have those qualifications, use them. Don't be shy about requesting therapy services. And the other thing is, I would encourage people to make a connection with their local fire departments and ask them, are you willing to, if we have children that are at risk for doing this, are you willing, with us present, to talk with them about the risks that fire presents? Because sometimes, and I know we've said this multiple times, but sometimes this is a curiosity, an impulse of things, but what isn't understand is how those things can lead to very, very serious consequences.
Well, and I like how both of you throughout this entire series, and I think it just kind of clicked on this specific episode, how you both bring in the youth to all of these like safety plans, family meetings, and you include them in all of those decisions instead of here's the safety plan, here's the plan, you're going to read it and sign it. You're really like bringing the youth into the whole family dynamic or the home setting and including them instead of telling them what to do. And it seems like that really helps in a lot of your case studies that you've shared too.
I would
I
think
agree,
so.
Chris. And I think I would just add on to that too, that there's a real respect and honor and curiosity tone that you guys give to this, more than a judgment or a harshness or a, rigidity around how we work with these kids. I just feel that when you talk about them, that you see their value, see their uniqueness, and there's just that desire to understand. And I think that's so important too as families work with kids. So thank you for kind of offering that to us and giving us those good examples.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
I appreciate that. And I was going to say that we've mentioned this before, but usually a behavioral issue can come down to a tragic expression of an unmet need. And the idea that families need to be aware that you'll have to dig deeper and you'll need help and you need to report any events like this. There's reporting requirements probably to connect, make good sense to connect with the caseworker. And with others too. I think, Charlie, the idea of the fire department and in the state of Minnesota, contacting the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, which has the state fire marshal has a specific website, and it says, don't hesitate to call. I think they know people and can connect you with people with mental health professionals and others that can help screen, further assess, and have interventions in place, which usually involve education and also like therapy, like you were talking about, Charlie, trauma therapy, things like that. So wonderful to talk with all of you again today.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much for all your wisdom, expertise, experience. For the whole series, this has been amazing. Thank you both.
Yeah. And the honeymoon period is not over. We'll have you back.
Okay.
Absolutely.
We feel safe now.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for joining us today for Let's Talk. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to our podcast. And tune in again soon.